Hi there, my name is David A. Robertson, and I am a author and a public speaker, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you to the organizers for asking me to take part in this festival, and I am here today to talk to you about representation. And this is a really important topic when it comes to comics, because you see this kind of sea change, this kind of shift that's happening, where in the past comics have been, historically awful in how they've represented Indigenous people, and now you're seeing more and more Indigenous people creating comics, and I almost look at it as the weapon that tore us down, we're using that same weapon to build us back up, and I like that. I like the fact that that's happening. But what I want to do is talk to you about, a negative representation, misrepresentation, and the impact that has, and then conversely, what positive representation can do, and the importance of it. And some of it might seem a little obvious, but I think there are things in the area of representation and how it shapes perceptions and self-perception and perceptions of others that are important for us to consider, especially if we're involved in the comics world. What sort of stories are we going to be reading, supporting, and sharing? So I think that this is an important topic, and it's a timely topic because more and more now we're realizing the not only how incredible a form of literature graphic novels and comics are, but how incredible a form of education comics and graphic novels are. When I started doing comics 12 years ago, I did it explicitly for educational purposes. Like I wrote comics for the classroom, and now 10, 12 years later, you're seeing more and more teachers integrating graphic novels into the curriculum, not without its drawbacks, not without its speed bumps or whatever you want to call it. I'll talk about that in a little bit too, and it's really that comes out of historical impacts. But I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean. So I think that you're seeing more and more teachers use it. You're seeing more and more librarians stock graphic novels in their collections, and of course, like kids have always read comics. So, and that's in the past has been the problem, and now is a benefit. So that's what I want to do, and I'm glad to be here doing it to an audience that hopefully that you're receptive to it, and that it at least evokes some sort of conversation, further discussion, and thought. So I think the best way to do it is talk to you about the role it played in my life, the misrepresentation when I was a kid, I guess a little bit about myself to start. I'm Cree, so my dad was born and raised in Norway House Cree Nation, which is just about 8 hours north of Winnipeg, where I live now. And that's also my band, my home community at Norway House. I've never lived there, but it definitely is home to me. I go there quite a bit. I live in Winnipeg now, and I've written about 28 books in my career, and a lot of them have been graphic novels. And I'm not going to make a distinction between comics and graphic novels. I'm going to say either comics or graphic novels interchangeably, even though I know there are some nuances in how the two differ. But when you open the page, they look the same, right? So I think that's I'll use either term. This isn't a workshop about terminology, so of comics and graphic novels. I started my career doing comics. I've done picture books, YA, middle grade, memoir, literary fiction, you name it. I've done a lot of books in my career in a lot of different forms, a lot of different genres. Because of that, they've been about different things. Whether it's Gabriel Dumont and the Red River Resistance, not rebellion, resistance. Whether it's Pauline Johnston, Tommy Prince, whether it's a memoir about a father and a son, whether it's a fantasy adventure like the Barren Grounds, so whether it's a picture book like On the Trapline, they've all been about different things, and multiple things. I think each book has a few messages, a few things to teach. I think what the common thread between all of them is, not just because I think the obvious thing is to say that they're all Indigenous, and that's fair. They all do have very strong Indigenous content, but I think they all have representation in mind, and it's something I've thought more and more as my writing career has progressed. Is how it is almost like as a responsibility of how I'm going to contribute to this new landscape of positive and truthful representations, and it's something that I've been doing for the last 12 years. So they're all whether my books are about one thing or another, they're always about at least representation as a common thread between all of them. And there's a reason for that. I think that representation helps shape the self-perception. So when kids see themselves reflected in literature truthfully, it builds self-confidence. It's empowering. When representation is negative, it shapes a negative self-perception, low self-esteem, and then when like when a white kid reads a comic book with a stereotypical Indigenous character, it informs how they view Indigenous people in the real world. It just inherently does that. It has that influence. Popular culture is incredibly influential. It's really how I learned about the world that I lived in and in myself and my place in the world, but also how kids learn about their place in the world they live in today. So pop culture is always going to have a huge influence, and it's always going to be one of the most important ways, and one of the most one of the most powerful ways that we learn about each other. We learn about the world more than ever, I think, and so when I was a kid, I guess I want to talk about it's this influence of misrepresentations in my childhood when I was a kid, and how that kind of impacted me then and now, and whether now how it informs decisions of mine and the work that I do, but then how it impacted me as a child, and my self-confidence and my ability to interact with others, and to feel like I had a place in the world, and the reason why I think that there's different avenues through which we learn about the world. For me as an Indigenous kid, a Cree kid, there were only a couple places where I could have really learned at that time potentially about myself and my background and Indigenous people, of which I am one, and one of them would have been from my dad, and we learned a lot from our family, but my parents weren't together. So when I was a kid, so my mom raised us, and I didn't have a lot of time with dad. And when you're a kid in a single parent household, you just don't really get into those in-depth conversations about life and history and all those things. And so my dad also just had this philosophy in his own life of not interfering in my development in terms of figuring out my identity. He wanted to model it, but the reality is that he wasn't around a lot to do that modeling, and he didn't want to interfere with how my journey to self-discovery, I guess. And I respect that. I mean, I think that I would do things a little differently. I have 5 kids, and I think that we learn from the ways in which we were raised when we raised our own children. But I respect that. I mean, I worked for my identity. I think that it's in the end it was positive, but initially it was bumpy, to say the least. So, and I think that the other place that I could have learned some truth, I should have learned some truth, was in school, and Indigenous people, history that involved Indigenous people, Canadian history. It was either mostly ignored or just it was just scratched the surface. And, I think about learning about the fur trade was really the only way that I learned about Indigenous people in school. We never learned about residential schools. I never even knew they existed. And my grandmother went to a residential school. So the school system was, that was a big failure. And it was, it was a universal failure. It just wasn't something that was in any curriculum that I know of in the 80s and into the 90s. It wasn't until I was out of university almost that I learned about residential schools, which is it's very common. Even up until a few years ago, I would have kids and parents that had never learned about residential schools before, didn't know what they were. And it's that's a big failure of not the people, but of the systems in place that are supposed to support us and educate us about the realities of the country and the world that we live in and our past. And they just weren't doing it. They just said, we're just going to gloss over that part because we don't really like what we did, or even if there's a self-awareness of what they did. What was done, that's another thing. But so I was left to learn about myself through popular culture, through the different elements of popular culture, the different I don't know what you call them, the different mediums, the different structures, whatever you call them in popular culture, like film, television, books, comic books, media. Media still has inherent biases in how they represent people of color. All those things do. Still, it's a little better now, or at least more subversive or more subtle. But back then it was very overt, and so now it's just, we still have work to do, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But when I was a kid, I was influenced by a lot of these things, watching Peter Pan and listening to what made the Red Man red, or watching things like Pocahontas and seeing how she was represented and sexualized, and how that led to costumes like Pocahontas, and how those representations influenced perceptions of Indigenous women and girls that does become very dangerous. So I think we're also talking a little bit about appropriation. I think there's a relationship between representation and appropriation. Appropriation is borrowing elements from a marginalized culture, from a dominant culture, and using those elements for personal gain or profit. Is essentially what appropriation is. And so a lot of these acts of appropriation were also inherently acts of misrepresentation. So because of a lot of issues, because there wasn't knowledge, because there wasn't context, because whatever it might be, or it was just overt racism, like things like Chief Wahoo, the mascot for the Cleveland baseball team. So I had all these things, really indoctrinating what Indigenous people are in my life, and the biggest culprit, I would say, because I was a comic book kind of nerd growing up, were comics, and historically comics have been pretty awful in how they have represented Indigenous people. It's just a fact of life. That's just how they were. and so reading all of these comics and seeing the Indigenous representation in these comics, it started to shape not only my self-perception, because I saw myself as the things that I was reading, the stereotypes, the misrepresentations. I began to see myself in that way. That those lies and their lies, falsities, became my truth, and they became other people's truths. I think that's really an important point, because you think like, what do you mean these lies are somebody's truth? Well, I use the analogy of like a book like Room, and that's to think about this kid who was raised in essentially like a big box, like a very, very small room, and he was born in that room because his mother was kidnapped and raped, and she had a child, and she was held captive for years, and so this kid was raised in this one little room, and to protect, I think, this kid and the horrors of the reality that she was aware of, she raised this kid to believe that all of existence was in this one room. There's nothing outside of the room, right? So it was just the universe was this one room, and how would the kid know otherwise, right? Because that became the boy's truth, because there was nothing to present any other truth, and so if we don't know, it just becomes something that we can't know, and we wouldn't think to know. And I think that then the kid and the mother escape, and then all of a sudden the boy is outside the room and opens his eyes to see that there's a whole new world that he never knew existed before, and so the what I think the work is to open eyes, to open doors, so that people can walk outside that room and see that there's a whole other truth that they were never presented with. And I think there's a lot more opportunity today than there was years ago to do that. I started writing comics 12 years ago with the intent to educate people about truths about Indigenous people, through positive representations and truthful representations. And now, today, there are a lot of Indigenous writers who are creating comics because they recognize the power of comics to educate, to engage, and to as an avenue through which we can teach people what Indigenous people really are, true history. So it's a really encouraging and exciting time. But back in the 80s, that those things just weren't happening. We were inside the room. We were inside this little room, and that little room was our truth. And I do talk about these little boxes that we place things in, whether and that we're kind of like we're trapped within these boxes in terms of the context of in this case Indigenous people and how they're represented. And so in comics, you could really you could place Indigenous people into 3 different categories, and so they were the dead Indian, and that's not like necessarily like a physically dead Indigenous person. It's like an Indigenous person whose culture is dead, who has left their culture behind, and as though their culture is no longer relevant, as though there is no intrinsic value to their culture. It's just a relic, and that's what the trope of the dead Indian is, the stereotype of the dead Indian. So we can place a lot of people indigenous people in comics in that box. So that's one. Another one is of the savage Indian, and that is an Indigenous person who is the kind of barbaric, uncivilized red man that has been written about and drawn and depicted in a lot of different mediums, and not all in distant past either. So they're the ones that are going to chase after you, shooting arrows and eventually scalp you, and they have no real familial structure, really no justice, no structure to their justice, no structure to their education, no structure to any of that. They're really savages, right? And so the reality is, obviously, that's not the reality, but that is the truth that was presented. And you call that the savage Indian. So a lot of indigenous people fit into that stereotypical little box. Good example is something like in Back to the Future, Back to the Future 3, where Marty McFly goes back in time to save Doc from, well, I'm going to nerd out about it. I actually don't mind that movie, but Marty McFly, when he kind of goes into the DeLorean and appears in the past, he's confronted with like a whole bunch of savage Indians who are chasing after the DeLorean and shooting arrows at it and doing their war cries, and so that's so it's kind of like supposed to be a funny scene, but if you really dig at it, you're going to uncover a lot of problematic stuff, and I think that's part of the job is to really inspect these things for what they are, and to consider the damage that they do. Because whether you think it's a big deal or not, even the smallest misrepresentation plants a seed that can become something at best problematic, at worst very dangerous. And the other one is the noble savage, right? And so the noble savage is a savage Indian who has somehow been civilized, right? And a very famous one is of like Tonto, the Lone Ranger. Tonto is like a noble savage, and so almost every indigenous person in the past in history can be placed into one of those three boxes, and then it becomes. It becomes a big problem. And there's a lot of examples. I'm going to give you one, but there's a lot of examples. There's even famously like Superman, was in one issue went back in time to try and convince an indigenous tribe to sign a treaty to give up their land. And then he goes back into the present. And there's a wampum belt, I believe, which is actually culturally significant, but it's presented as like this, something different than what it is, and how that meeting was kind of like, and that agreement was put into the wampum belt, and so the land was given up because of Superman messing with time, right? And then Clark Kent, for some reason, wears a headdress at the end, which is not appropriate either. It's just like Blackhawks fans going to games and wearing their headdresses to the games. That's like a en masse act of appropriation. So that's one example. But I recently, not recently, but in the last couple of years, went out and bought this comic, and I love Firestorm, by the way, but. I bought this because I remembered the villain in this one, and the villain in this one is a dude named Black Bison. I'll just show you a quick little picture of what Black Bison looks like. And this is like a very stereotypical representation of an indigenous person, how we have presented indigenous people to be, right, in popular culture. And in comics, he's got like the head covering, he's got like the chiseled abs and the topless. He's got like the spear and the shield, and he's got like mucklucks, I guess, on, and he just looks like like there he looks like a savage Indian, right? So, but this story is one where you kind of have the guy who like almost embodies all of the tropes at once. So it's like was doing very hard work, right? To in a way to do a lot of damage. And Black Bison is a villain that is recurring in Firestorm, and the story behind it is that this guy John Ravenhair is like I think he's like a curator. I haven't read it for a little bit, but he's like a curator at a museum. There he is, right there. And he has put together an exhibit of artifacts from his culture to show to the public, as though we're like a curiosity, right? And so he's done this exhibit, and his great grandfather is not pleased about this, right? So he's actually pretty upset about it, right? And you see there, he's like this angry Indian. That's another one is like we like to present Indigenous people as like angry Indians, right? So he's like the angry Indian. I don't know a lot of elders who actually act like this, but so like he's reading the paper and he goes, Indian antiquities donated to New York Museum of Natural History. And he goes, many of the pieces belong to the Bison, called an intertribe fraternity that first came into being in the late 1800s during the last uprising of thieves. First they stole our land, now they steal our history. It's that's actually like accurate. But like the difference here is that this dude, this elder, says he doesn't want reconciliation, which is what we all kind of want to work towards. He wants vengeance. Right? He actually says, "I want vengeance. You want understanding. I want vengeance for what the white man has done to my people." And so later in this comic, he, as John Ravenhair is leading kids through this exhibit, the grandfather does this ceremony in the middle of a park and does this like incantation, this ceremony in the middle of a park. And as he's doing this ceremony, he's like murdered by a couple of thugs, and so when he's murdered, the spirit of his grandfather kind of like inhabits John Ravenhair, and so he becomes the supervillain named Black Bison, and he becomes this like really angry, superpowered Indian, and he has very stereotypical Indigenous powers too. Like that's the other thing is like when you have Indigenous people represented in comics, they usually have very stereotypical powers. They're usually very spiritual powers. They have, the Black Bison can like reanimate stuffed animals. And he goes and breaks the artifacts out of the museum and dons them. He dons like the bison head, and he dons the bison headdress, and he becomes the Black Bison. He says Ravenhair was weak, a puppet for the white men who plucked his strings. He lives no more. I have taken his place, I who was named Black Cloud in Morning, son of Thunder Arrow, who was son of Red Desert. I'm sorry. It's not funny, but it is. Who was son of Red Desert and Nightwind, who was son of the great shaman. That's the other thing is like very shamanistic, right? So you have like an elder in these comics. They're usually very shamanistic, and these heroes have very shamanistic powers. A leader of the Bison cult, whose soul now looks through my eyes. His name was Bison, black as midnight sky. My name is Black Bison. And so he goes and he kind of wreaks havoc, and then Firestorm has to obviously apprehend and defeat him. So I brought this example because I remembered it as a kid. It was published in 1982, so I would have read it when I was like, I was 5 when it was published, but I would have read it when I was like, maybe 9, 10 years old, and so you have so what's the big deal, I guess, is the question. Like, what is the big deal? Why is this a big deal? What's the problem? I wrote about representation and appropriation in a CBC article like 2 years ago, and I got a lot of mail from people, and a lot of them called me thin-skinned. A lot of them told me to get over it. A lot of them told me that it wasn't a big deal, or tried to educate me about, if it's so not okay to dress up as Pocahontas, then why is it okay to dress up as a pirate? Isn't that offensive to pirates? That's a very common argument. Appropriation has to be done to a historically oppressed group, historically oppressed culture, and by the dominant culture, right? The dominant culture, and so the question of what's the big deal, like, so you have Black lives, and so what? Get over it, right? So you have someone who is dressing up as an Indigenous sexy princess, big deal, right? Well, all of these things shapes perceptions, and I think that for me that's the bottom line. It shapes how we see ourselves as Indigenous people, and I think the main focus is Indigenous children. So how Indigenous children view themselves, when they see this comic, how do you think they're taught to perceive themselves when it's everywhere, right? When it's not just this comic, but it's everything. When it's every medium, and then you have. I just got to show you something funny I just saw in the back. I never noticed it before. But and then you have like a white kid reading this, who sees someone that looks like him, who's like a really badass, awesome superhero, Firestorm, and the Indigenous guy is the villain. He's a stereotype, right? And so, then how does the white kid also start to perceive Indigenous people when they're inundated with images and stereotypes like this, right? And so they plant little seeds. What I wanted to show you that I saw was funny was this free Lone Ranger Western town on the back of this that you could get if you mailed in. And of course, you have like the Lone Ranger, General George Custer, Buffalo Bill Cody, and then Tonto and Scout. Scout's, I think, the horse right there. So that's everywhere. G.I. Joe had the shaman, right? So I mean, so it plants little seeds, and that seed may not seem dangerous at the time. It may seem that, why can't you get over it? But that seed grows into something that can be, at best, like I said, at best problematic, where it creates a situation where you have kids who feel ignored, misrepresented, and through that misrepresentation have developed a low self-esteem, a shame in their identities, which is what I felt. I didn't want anybody to think that I was Indigenous when I was a kid. I hid from it wherever I could, because I thought, because of all these things that I was reading about Indigenous people, I didn't think anybody would like me or want to be friends with me because I was Indigenous. So I just either hid from it or denied it, right? So when someone asked me if I was Indigenous or not, I would deny it. So at best, problematic. At worst, it becomes very dangerous. So, and a good example is, the sexualization of Indigenous women and girls, right? So you see someone like dressing up as a Pocahontas for Halloween. I saw recently on TikTok. I don't have a TikTok, but this model was dressed up as like an Indian princess in like leather bikini, pretty much, and a headdress and war paint, doing some kind of TikTok dance. And I said, like, man, that does a lot of damage, and that person probably does not realize it. I guess one of the things I'm not talking a lot about is like some ways that you can address things like that is like, reach out, right? So like, and do it, I think anger is not productive. my daughter's dance studio recently had someone dressing up as Pocahontas, like just a kid. They put in a Pocahontas costume, and I just reached out to them and I said, listen, can we just have a talk about this? Because I want to tell you the ways in which this is problematic. And they, to their credit, they got rid of the costume. And man, like sometimes that's all you need to do, right? Is just speak up about it and be an ally too. Like if you're not Indigenous and you see something like that, you can also speak up about it, right? Because it's just whoever's saying it, it's still not right? So, but anyway, so these costumes that sexualize Indigenous women, like the Pocahontas costume, well, that creates perceptions too, and creates expectations, and something like that becomes ingrained in the social consciousness when there's nothing else to teach otherwise. And again, like comics have done this historically very often. Especially including at least the sexualization of Indigenous women and girls. That expectation leads to the perceptions of Indigenous women and girls being something that they're not, right? So generations of this misrepresentation led to things like the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And it may seem like a stretch to say that, but it's not, because in Nepal, for example, in the early 70s, young white men would cruise around the town looking for Indigenous women. It's something I wrote about in my graphic novel, the Helen Betty Osborne story. It was called Betty. They would cruise around looking for Indigenous women to pick up and to try to party with, because they believed that Indigenous women were easy, that they liked to party, that they liked to drink, and where do you think that perception, that belief came from? It didn't just materialize out of nowhere, right? It was ingrained in how they saw Indigenous women and girls, and that kind of came from I think in the majority of it came from representation, right? And so we need to really think about those things, because it actually becomes, it can become very dangerous, and we need to think about why those things have happened and what we can do to change it. And so my work has and the work of a lot of Indigenous writers has been to try to begin to undo that damage through offering positive representations of Indigenous people in comics, in all forms, in all genres, whether it's historical fiction, whether it's superheroes, whether it's contemporary stories that addresses issues that Indigenous people face, accurate and truthful representations based on research, informed representations based on lived experiences, based on truth, and so I wanted to show you a couple of examples of what that looks like, and then talk about as opposed to the negative perceptions and what those misrepresentations do, what truthful representations do in terms of perception. And so one of the examples, and a lot of writers are I should name some of the writers in their work. So Katharina Vermette is doing a series called A Girl Called Echo, and it's looking at Métis history. Richard Van Camp has done a number of graphic novels. The Blanket of Butterflies, I believe, is one of them. Jen Storm did Firestarters, and Jay Ojek is a graphic novelist. He's also done some work with Robert Munch, which is pretty cool. And so there's a lot of Indigenous comic creators out there in the world right now. That's just a couple of them. they're doing amazing work to undo damage, right? And so some of the things that I've worked on is this my most recent graphic novel, which is The Reckoner Rises. The first book it's a series, and the first book is called Breakdown, and it's a sequel to my YA trilogy, The Reckoner. And what you have here is a accurately represented Cree teenager who has superpowers and becomes a superhero. And so what you have is a character who is, accurately represented, who is written by someone who understands Cree culture, who has real problems, and those problems are explained and discussed, and I think a really kind of nuanced and in-depth way, who has powers that are not stereotypical to Indigenous people. What I thought would be interesting is that I gave him stereotypically, just superhero powers, right? So he's very strong and he can heal and things like that. So those are powers that a lot of heroes have had in the past, but he doesn't have shamanistic spiritual powers. He's just really strong, and he can jump pretty high, and he can heal, things like that. So, and then another character in this who is named Eva, she can manipulate the wind, and she can do that fly and do really cool things with it. And so what this does, so it's a good story, and I think it's a good comic, it's a good graphic novel. But what is it? What actual good does it do? Well, I mean, two things, and this is really what I've been building up to talk to you about. One of them is it empowers Indigenous youth, Indigenous readers who see themselves reflected in the character, right? And so it's just being seen. We just, as Indigenous people, just haven't had heroes who look like us in any significant number. And now today we're seeing more and more comics who are presenting heroes, protagonists who are Indigenous that readers can see themselves reflected in, and that's empowering. And it helps to build self-esteem, self-confidence. It helps to make us feel strong in our identities. It doesn't put us in a situation where we have to feel ashamed of who we are. And because Cole deals with even mental health issues, it helps people who are dealing with mental health issues feel seen. It's another level of representation. And so this is a graphic novel that does that. Cole Harper is a super cool, badass superhero with a really cool costume. And there he is right there, kind of going in for a fight against a guy who can, well, I'm going to tell you a lot about it. I don't want to give stuff away, but so he's just it's just a awesome comic with a cool Cree kid. And he's not a stereotype. I think that's the main thing. He doesn't fit in any of those boxes. He breaks through those boxes and stands on his own. He has agency. And we need more and more comics like that. I just want to also quickly show you an anthology that's very important called This Place. And this is a story this is an anthology that's mostly history or historical fiction. But again, what you have is you have a lineup, and this is representation is best achieved through own voices stories. So Indigenous characters written by Indigenous writers. That's, it's not specific to just Indigenous people. I'm reading Gutter Child right now about J.L. Richardson, which is about a Black character written by a Black author. And that's an own voices story. Those are important. They help us to understand and see the world through the eyes of someone else. And that truth is important because it helps us to generate understanding and respect for people who are human beings like us, but who have differences that when we understand them, we begin to respect and embrace them rather than, judge and chastise someone for, being something that they're not because we've been ingrained to believe something that isn't true. And so this place compiles stories from like 10 really talented Indigenous writers and some Indigenous artists. People like Catherine Vermette. There's a foreword by Alicia Elliott, Sonia Sue, Jen Storm, myself, Katarina Quenzidem, Richard Van Camp, like a bunch of amazing, Negon Sinclair, Chelsea Val, and so it's a really important collection. Natasha Donovan illustrates too, and she's a Métis artist from, I think, the West Coast. I've done a lot of work with her, and really beautiful art. And listen, like it's really eclectic. It shows the breadth of skill and talent and voice, but they are stories that have accurate representations, truthful representations, Indigenous protagonists written with depth and with knowledge and with emotion, agency, and what all these comics do is they first of all teach non-Indigenous readers to perceive Indigenous people as from a place of truth and understanding and respect. They encourage Indigenous readers to build a strong sense of self-esteem and identity. They make them feel seen and empowered. And I think there's like another level to this too, is when like you see Indigenous writers, Indigenous comic creators doing work and being successful at it, you're also representing in another way where kids read comics like this, and they see that you're doing this work, and they see you doing a talk, like maybe there's a kid listening right now, and like with Jen Storm or Richard Van Camp or Kateri or Chelsea Val or whoever it might be, you see them doing well and they think, I can do that too. And that is another form of representation that is very important, because it helps people believe that they also have a space to tell their stories, stories of truth, stories that we need to hear. And that's the kind of environment, that's the kind of climate right now that we see in comics, in literature in Canada. It's growing and it's encouraging. We have a lot more work to do, but we're going in the right direction. And I think in the end, I just want us to be more aware of the things that we see and digest, so that we can make better choices in what we read, and what we create and what we support. And so I just want thank you for your time. I hope that this was helpful to you in some way. But again, just like look for Indigenous comics from Indigenous creators and read them and support them and share them, because it helps to undo a lot of damage that has been done in the past. It takes a long time to heal, but we need to go on that road together. And that's what reconciliation looks like, and that's what positive representation can do. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And thank you for having me here at this festival. And take care, Ekozani, which means thank you in Cree, and stay safe.